to overcome those challenges.
Right, that's true. So they will ask you, but wait for that. Knowing that they will ask you, you shouldn't talk about it in advance. You should be patient and wait for the moment, because they will ask you. Just be patient. That is, I think, a good point. Right. So after you talk about yourself, after they give a monologue, after you give a monologue, after they ask your interpersonal questions, it will move on to a technical part. And it will start off with some fundamentals questions. Questions about basic data structures, your core language syntax, object-oriented programming, maybe testing if they practice it, and probably just roughly what GitHub is and so on. So let's try and simulate such questions. So my first question would be, do you know what's the difference between a list and an array?
Well, an array is more like a data structure that's kind of a static structure, meaning that you can't really dynamically resize it on the fly. So when you need to expand it, add more or remove elements from it, you'll actually have to create a new array. So you have to reinstantiate it.
Mhm.
Whereas with a list, you have more options there. You can actually do that on the fly with the help with the functions that are available on the list class. So the list.add. That's an example that you can
All right.
use.
What do you think is more often used in C#, a list or an array?
Probably a list.
Okay. What do you know? When do you think should out keyword be used in C#? What's the use of out keyword?
Well, a couple of examples I have encountered. For example, when you have a function and one of the parameters, I think, has an out keyword that basically tells the function that after it runs, it will return that variable as well. So I think the usage there is that you can actually return more variables instead of just one with a simple return statement, probably.
All right.
I'm not sure if that's the best answer, but
that is good.
trying my best. Yeah. Yeah, the try first, as Michael said. Yeah.
Yeah. What else? What is the difference between a static and non-static classes?
So static means that, for example, you don't have to instantiate an object, so you don't have to create an object from a given class in order to use a particular method, for example. So I guess the usage of a static class is to have a lot of static functions which can be called without creating an object. So you just call them from the class itself.
And could you give an example of when you would have a static class?
I think array has something like that. There are some array operations that we use or can use. Can't exactly recall that method, but I know that array, for example, has a lot of static uses. Sometimes actually it's better to use them instead of using the
could you be
methods.
more clear about what you mean by saying array? Array what? Like int with brackets or something else? For example, array of ints or something else that you have in mind?
Just thinking.
Or maybe you can give a better example.
Or for example, let's use the most recent ones that I have used is string.split, or for example. So you can pass a string into the string.split function, which will essentially return an array, which will be elements of the string separated by a separator, for example. And in that case, you don't need to create an instance of a string in order to call the split method.
Okay.
You just use the string split method.
And what about in try-parse? Is it non-static method?
Try-parse is static, I think. For example, int.try-parse would be a way of parsing an integer or float.try-parse. You could that way parse a float, and if it would return a boolean, for example, and if the parse was successful, you could use an out keyword to output a variable, so the parse value, for example.
All right. If we divide an integer 1 from an integer 2, literally values are 1 and 2, what will be the result?
I remember that was in your Kahoot. I think it would be 0.
And why is that?
Probably because of the rounding. So the result would be 0.5. And I think that it will be automatically rounded down to 0.
How do you need to divide 1 from 2 to get 1? The remainder?
You would have to cast them to float, or just store them in a float variable, and then you would do the division there, and the result would be stored in another float.
If we cast the float, we'll get 0.5, but I expect 1 as the result, so... How do we divide 1 from 2 to get 1?
Right, so let's have one more clear example. If you divide 10 by 20, so not 1 by 2, but 10 by 20, we expect 10 to be returned. As that's the remainder, it does not fit in 20, so we want 10 to be returned.
Yes.
Yeah, you would use the percent sign, so 10%, 20, and that would return you the remainder.
Yes. All right, and finally, what's the difference between float and decimal?
Float has a smaller size in memory, whereas decimal has a much larger, meaning that the precision of the numbers is much better, so it can contain a larger range of numbers.
When should you use decimal?
Probably when working with currency. So if you're creating a application that's for a banking company, you would, and they handle transactions, you probably use.
Right. Let's move on to OP questions. What do you know about object-oriented programming? Have you heard about it?
Yep. Well, probably the most well-versed, or the well-versed in probably classes. I know a bit about inheritance, polymorphism, and also very little about interfaces. Let's start with classes, I'd say. So I know that classes are different than objects. So for example, a class is like a blueprint from which you can instantiate objects. And an object is essentially an item that you have created in memory, a reference type that you've created in memory that was built via a class using a constructor. Now, other concepts like inheritance is that, for example, if you have a class like animals, and you have other smaller classes like a dog or a bird, you could, since dogs and birds are all animals, you could inherit from the animal class. So for example, if animal class has functions like make a sound, then you could reuse that from the animal class when you're working with the dog or the bird class. And I think polymorphism is when you actually do something that when you have a make a sound function, and even though you're inheriting it from the animal class, for example, you would use different variations of it, so the outcome would be different when you call make a sound from the dog or the bird class. so dog would bark, for example, and a bird would, I don't know what they would do. They would make some kind of sound.
Can we, is it possible to store different animals like dogs and cats and birds into the same data structure?
Well, what came to my mind is, for example, an array of objects, where it's not really defined what kind of object that array will contain.
Okay.
It'll just contain.
Given bird, dog, and cat all derives from an animal class, how is possible to store them all in the same data structure?
What if you store the objects of the animal class in the structure?
Right. And how do you demonstrate polymorphism then, given you have an array of animals? And given that every animal has its own way of making a sound?
Not sure if I'll be able to answer this.
You will? You know the answer.
I'm just think about it. So if I'm storing objects of animals inside of a data structure, and am I accessing the individual elements of that data structure, I would be able to call the make a sound function. I don't know the exact behavior, but if I got the concept of inheritance and polymorphism right, then what it should do is for each object in the data structure, when it calls the make a sound function, it should probably identify somehow what subclass, if there's such a thing, it belongs to.
Very close. We'll discuss this after the questions.
Yeah, I haven't reached chapter 2 yet, so I'm kind of in the
it's okay.
Like out there.
All right. So, do you use inheritance often when you're writing code?
Sadly, I'm not, but I think I should.
It depends. It's not that horrible if you don't use it. It's when you're just starting out, it's good to use it probably, but when you are already experienced, you tend to be careful about using it. But it's way out of your scope to discuss those differences, so just leave it at there. Let's continue. You mentioned that we can store them all in object type, like in array of objects, different objects. How does that work? Why can we store it in object? What is an object in .NET?
Basically, a reference type stored in memory.
Can I store an integer as an object?
Yeah, then yes, you can. In this case, it should be reference and value types as well, so they should both count as objects.
So it's not just for reference types, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is int a reference type?
It's a value type.
Okay. And what's the difference when you pass a value type versus reference type?
So a value type is something that's stored in the stack, and essentially it's kind of a lightweight class of how it was described to me. So instead of storing a reference to the address of that given object in memory, it immediately stores the value. So if you, for example, create a variable int a, make it equal to 1, and you create an int b, make it equal to 2, and then you do something like I'm just thinking. So what I wanted to say is that when you have two value types and they both have the same values, changing one of the value types will not change the other one. So if I have A, which equals 1, and B equals 1 as well, changing B will not affect A. Whereas with a reference type, for example, if I have an object with person class, which has a first name, and then I create two different objects with two different first names, and then I make the second object to be equal to the first object, then it will actually, what will actually happen under the hood is that it will grab the reference of the first person object I have created. And if I change the first name of the second person, that will affect the first person as well, because they are reference types. They are pointing to an address in memory instead of the exact value, as it happens with value types.
Yes, that's correct. Okay, let's move on. What do you know about testing?
From what I've done, or what I know about testing is what we have done through the homework. So how should I put that?
Just say what you know about testing, and don't need to be very...
So I guess the main aim of testing would be is to be able to test different parts of the code individually. So when you're actually troubleshooting and testing a part of your application, you don't want to go all the way down the rabbit hole to find what method or function fails at which stage. You probably have to build up testing functions or build up your application in a way that it can be tested in units, probably. So that's probably the most I know about testing. Or
all right, that's fine. What about Git? To what extent have you used it? What Git hosts do you know, and what's your personal experience with Git?
I've used Git through GitHub. I also have Git Bash, which I have used a little bit, but it has similar syntax to Linux command line, and it's quite familiar. But I'm more familiar with using Git through Visual Studio, for example. So I have a couple of so I have a fork from the C# in Zero to Hero repository, and I, on a daily or a bi-daily basis, I push from my local repository to that remote fork I have on my GitHub account. And when I have a homework that's ready, then I usually open a pull request to your corresponding branch regarding the homework.
Okay. So if you commit, so when you make changes, and let's say you are on a master branch and you have some changes made on a master branch, and then you create a new branch of the master branch and switch to it, what will happen with the changes?
So I have made changes on the master branch, which I haven't committed and pushed.
Yes. And I branched off that branch, yeah.
Well, that branch shouldn't have my changes in there, so it should be exact copy of the master branch before I did the changes, because I haven't committed and pushed them to the repository yet.
Okay, that's not correct. Those changes are locally, so when you create a branch, you will copy the branch, but the changes will remain because they are not linked to any repository.
Actually, that makes sense. So I have the branches locally stored on my computer as well, and actually I'm making the changes there. Even though I have not pushed them, they are still there locally on my.
Yes. So what happens when you commit to the files that you have locally?
So when I do a commit, there's a thing called the staging area. I think that's what it's called. So when I modify files, they go to the working area. When I do git add in git bash, git add dot, then that adds all the modified files to the staging area. And when I do a commit, things in the staging area are pushed, not pushed, but are saved to that branch on which I am right now, or which I specify. No, it pushes or it commits to the branch that I'm on. Sorry.
Yes, yeah. And what happens when you push?
When I push that local branch to a branch which sits on my remote repository.
Okay, and how do you, let's say, what do you do when you want to introduce, like, to give your changes, to request your changes to be added into a certain branch that is locked, protected, and that you cannot commit directly to?
That's what pull requests are probably for. So if I have a fork from another remote branch, then I would do a pull request that would basically ask the person who's the owner of that separate remote branch to review my changes in my own remote repository, and if they approve it, then that gets pulled into the branch I have specified in the pull request.
Okay, that's correct. Next part would be advanced, but no point asking advanced. I don't think you would answer any of those, so we'll skip that part. Practical application, also something more of an advanced part, and in fact this is also optional. It sometimes gets asked, sometimes doesn't get asked. When I was going through job interviews in 2 places, I did get asked about caching and logging and this. So it does get asked, especially caching, but not important for you at the moment. So to review your answers for this, if we go back to what you were asked, overall about, well, first, what I didn't like is I think you weren't specific enough. So be specific. Be specific. Don't. So for obvious things, when you say, okay, what is decimal for? And you said it's for currency. And then you went off with an example that just talks about the same point that is already clear. Like if it's for currency and then you said for application that will use something that is currency based, that is already clear, and you basically said the same thing being verbose and didn't give any extra information with the way you talked about it. So if it doesn't deliver any extra information already, you should just skip it. Just be concise and specific. Don't overdo it.
Probably I do that because I'm kind of teaching myself as well in the way, so I'm kind of reinforcing those concepts in my head as I'm talking.
Yeah, but that also gives a sense of, insecurity and not being sure what the answer is and just floating a bit, which isn't the greatest thing. It's good for learning, I agree that, I don't argue about that, but for showing that for an interviewer, it's not the greatest thing, I think. Your answers about language, about differences, I think you said it correctly overall. I didn't like the start of you talking about array, that it's static, because it's very ambiguous. So you should be careful with ambiguity when you describe different structures, types, and so on. Static is a reserved keyword and it means a very specific thing. And if possible, you should give words that better illustrate the point. So instead of static, you should have said immutable. That
So,
size is
can
immutable. Yes.
He actually said like static and he made like a comparison between static and dynamic.
Yes. Yeah.
Which in this case I think was pretty okay.
Yeah.
Like arrays are not dynamic, which is, yeah, I think it was right in this case, but
yes. Well, just the first 3 words gave me a different set me to a wrong direction, but when you continued, it was correct in the end. That was good.
So I actually wrote down that it was a perfect usage of the words. So
okay,
yeah.
that is fine. And I think overall about C sharp, basic C sharp questions, you've answered pretty okay. I think overall nothing to pick on. About data structures, array versus list, also that was fine. And indeed, list is more often used. About OP, as you said, you still have a lot to learn. And before you go to an interview, I would definitely try to look through those 4 principles, the 4 pillars. You did answer what polymorphism and inheritance is for sure. I was satisfied with those answers. You could have answered about encapsulation. I'm sure you know that. It's just basically um, a a literal capsule that holds related data and info and hides stuff that's not needed, uh, and exposes stuff more like. So you can explain that as well. At this level already, I liked your explanation of a class and how does this differ from an object, that the class is a blueprint and an object is an item. Um, about testing, you don't have to know how to do testing, but it's nice to be aware what kind of testing there is. And based on your definition, it seemed that you think about testing as only automated testing, but you can still do manual testing, like just uh, clicking something with your hand, seeing if the output is correct in the console. That is a kind of testing as well. It's called regression testing when you do it manually. And when we do it in bootcamp, it's called unit testing because we're testing a function in isolation. A unit in isolation. It doesn't have to be a function. It can be a class or a component itself, as long as you can isolate it.
Yeah. Question about encapsulation. So I've done some Googling about that in the past, and usually they tend to put it in really crazy words, so they try to overcomplicate it. Not sure if I understood that concept right, but encapsulation, would that mean that you basically store data and
think about it this way. Think about public versus private. When would you have a private method? When would you have it public?
Yeah. That's one thing, and the second part of it is to just closely related stuff but should be put in one place, and that place is a class. So and then what you don't need, you hide, basically. And
so to better summarize it, it'd be or at least the way I've always thought about it is you're hiding what you don't need. Like Kai said, if you don't need to show it to the world, don't show it. If it doesn't need to be edited or in some way, shape, or form, don't show it.
Yes.
What I've read about this is a lot of places people like to say that try to not expose, try to expose as little about a class as you can. And in most of the cases, they don't really tell you why. But I guess the reason is that you don't really want, because you're eventually going to work in a team with other developers, and you don't really want to expose the internals of the class. So you don't want that class to end up in a wrong state kind of thing, or just change underlying variables that should not be changed, I guess.
Yes, your goal as a developer should be minimize the scope you need to care about at the time, and minimize the choices you need to make. So the less you know about, the less choices you have, the less likely you are to make a mistake.
I haven't reached properties yet, but I guess that's why they are used very extensively. So instead of making everything public, you just make getters and setters and.
Right. So the actual question is, why would you make something public? Like, it's not when would you make something private, but when would you make something public?
Yeah, that's a very good point.
That's the perspective you have to get into when you're developing software. Only show that what's required.
Yeah. Um, so, what does it mean to hide things? Basically, when you have a single class, now you don't see its details, and you basically can look at it as a whole. You don't need to treat it as raw properties. You don't need to treat something as a collection of 10 properties, for example, 10 fields. You can treat it as a single object. So that simplifies things for us to work with. Because imagine if you typed letter A and everything were included, all properties that ever existed for every class, every namespace, everything. And you type letter A and your selection pops up with thousands of things that start with letter A. That is insane and something that you don't want. So you want to reduce the scope of options that you have at a time, and encapsulation does just that.
In other words, it's a container. It containerizes your code. So you're going to put it in containers. That's encapsulation.
Yes. Many different definitions, and I really hate the general Wikipedia or scientific definition because it doesn't serve justice of defining it properly. Just keep it simple and say that it hides the details that we don't need to care about, encapsulates data and closely related stuff together.
Mm-hmm. So in definition I found that I think a bit better is about encapsulation is that it's basically binding of data and functions together to keep them safe from outside interference.
Yes, that's also great. Because some data is private, and the only way you never expose publicly fields as is, you don't allow data to go publicly. You only allow for it to be accessed through methods. And properties are also a kind of methods. So never ever will you work with data publicly. Well, sometimes, but in super rare cases. All right. I loved your answers about Git. I think they were really good, spot on. Except for the first one on what happens when you branch off something that you didn't commit. But the rest was spot on. You talked about the areas how the flow, how the files move, and that is spot on, and that is exactly what I expected. That is what is needed to understand when working in your daily flow. So that is definitely good enough.
Right, but also when he made a mistake and you explained a little bit, he could tell you more about why, and I think that's maybe even better than answering it correctly the first time.
Yes.
So
I think overall Git is great. The Git seems, out of all the things that you said, Git is your strong point.
Also, I noticed that you forget to talk about the static classes.
I did ask about the difference between static and non-static.
No, I mean to review the answer.
Oh yeah.
So I think definitely that's something we should mention. Read more about static classes. I think that you were very confused. Also, I'm not sure. I think that you were confused between that you were thinking I was asking about extension methods, and in general, I didn't really get what you were trying to say. So yeah, read up on static classes, know when to use it.
Yeah.
Would that have been a better answer? For example, like a static class cannot be instantiated, whereas
yes.
Well, that's an answer, but it's not when would you use it, and that's a very big difference, and it's very difficult to. I guess it's for a junior, you don't have to expect that someone knows it, maybe. But it's definitely good to look into it.
Yeah. I would say static should. When someone says static in context of .NET, you should think about something that is global and singular and cannot be instantiated, so it ever exists one of that thing, of that static thing, as opposed to non-static, which can have multiple instances of non-static. But
I'm gonna have to disagree with the not instantiate. Instead of you explicitly instantiating these objects, the compiler, the runtime will instantiate it for you. That's your difference between static and non-static.
Yeah. Yes, that is a good point. You can still have a static constructor. Everything has a constructor. So there's always static constructor that you can use. So it's a better definition to ever being instantiated once. If you want to be technical, you can say it cannot be instantiated explicitly from the outside. That would be a more accurate definition, but that wouldn't serve much practical use. So yeah, it's ever going to be one, and yeah.
Also, a question from the chat: would you use a static method to do work on something else that has been instantiated, like a variable? So yes, static methods are mostly used in helpers, helper classes, and for instance, processes. If you have input, conversion, output, like the three steps that are very generic, I guess, processes, that's when you definitely use static classes.
As long as it doesn't have a state inside itself, as long as static doesn't keep a global state, it's fine to have a short-lived function that just does something for you, that takes input and returns output. That is a good case for static. All right. Thanks for the remarks. So yeah, Git was great.
What about the reference versus value?
All right. So I think overall he explained it all right. I think overall he explained it all right. Like if you pass a reference, he did say that it will keep the changes in a method, for example, because it's pointing to the same reference. So changing value is still changing value of the same reference if we have an object in mind. And he did mention that if we have a value type, it gets stored on a stack, and it gets copied over when we pass it, which is also correct. So I think that is a good enough answer for that. I just think, again, that it is probably a bit too detailed and should have been a bit more concise and precise. All right, and those things, the advanced topics and practical application, I don't think that you'll be asked, well, about Solid you might be asked as a junior. About web services, or at least the RESTful services, you probably will be asked. About entity framework, something that is framework specific, you are likely to be asked, especially based on job description. And on top of this, I would add that you'll be asked about basic of HTML and JavaScript as well. So you should also have core language JavaScript in your skill set. Be just ready to answer, though it's very similar to C#. For the basic stuff, for the core stuff, it's very similar. So you didn't guess when you didn't know, you say so. Oh, also about static, one more thing. When you talked about array, I think that was off the tracks completely. And I tried to bring you back on track by asking to specify, but I think you were actually off track. So I didn't know exactly why were you going that direction, because you had a sense what static was, but then you talked about array. And
right.
Yeah, array class does have static methods, but that is array class, not.
Yeah, so he mentioned the split method of string.
Yeah, those, like, so the answer was like 70% correct or 80% correct, but the array part was off. And then problem solving. I'm not sure if you want to do this part, so let me know if you want to.
Oh, we can give it a try.
Do you mind sharing your screen? On Discord, you can stream. I can show you how. So if you go on Discord and